Aerith says, "You coming?" And then we come. Okay, I'll just say that again. Hello everyone, and welcome back to this Final Fantasy VII Rebirth analysis series. I'm Nökkvi from Birds of Play, and I'm joined here by Pétur from Birds of Play. Say hi, Pétur.
Hello.
And the one and only Alleyway Jack.
Hello.
So, Alleyway Jack, would you like to catch us up to speed on where we're at?
Sure thing. So, those of you that watched the first episode, you'll know that we managed to get through Chapter 1. There was a variety of things going on there. We had a range of wild new things, such as Zack being reintroduced. We also had a relatively sort of a familiar experience of going through the Nibelheim flashback, which is consistent with the original game. And that very much onboarded us and introduced us to what was going on in Final Fantasy VII Rebirth. And if you haven't watched that episode, I'd recommend going back and watching that first. But now we arrive at Chapter 2, and I suppose the game starts snowballing a lot more here. You know, we start becoming opened up to a lot more things that are happening. So, kicking off, Cloud wakes up in the inn at the village of Calm. Everyone else is sort of not there. And we are immediately introduced to one of many of the new experiences that Final Fantasy VII Rebirth has to offer, which is a pack of Queen's Blood cards that are sort of hanging on his door. Quite quickly, we go downstairs and we're introduced to Broden, who may or may not have some significance. He's the innkeeper, and he introduces us to, no, he suggests to us to go and see the Folio guy. So we have this new Folio system that's being introduced as well. And then just quickly, we can sort of recap this a bit more. We go outside, we're introduced to Red 13, and the party members are outside in the village of Calm, and we're introduced to yet another piece of sort of gameplay mechanic, which is the relationship system with our fellow party members, which is where they kind of have these smiley faces above their heads, and we sort of can establish relationships with them through dialogue options. So within the first 5 minutes of Chapter 2, we've got a hell of a lot more stuff going on that isn't necessarily narratively pertinent, which we had in Chapter 1, but it is showing the sort of breadth of the game mechanics in this game. So yeah, but that's where we're at. That's what we're introduced to as we jump into Chapter 2.
Exactly. So we'd like to take a little bit of a closer look at these three things: Queen's Blood, the Folios, and the relationship system, starting with maybe Queen's Blood. I know that you did a video on it, which people could go check out.
Yes.
But
yeah.
How do you feel about Queen's Blood? Have you any opinions on it, or?
So I've never shied from being a massive Final Fantasy VIII fanboy, and I think a lot of people, when they first sort of found Queen's Blood and you know understood it was a card game, they sort of saw perhaps a nod back to Triple Triad, which is sort of the infamous Final Fantasy VIII sort of game. Everyone tends to sort of ignore Tetra Master from 9, but I was eager to try that out, so I actually prioritized it. The first thing I did when I kind of got through that funnel of meeting Broden and going out into Calm was I tried finding people to play Queen's Blood with, and to be honest, I really enjoyed that game. Like I prioritized the Queen's Blood quests as we'll sort of perhaps discuss a bit more in future, but I did prioritize that as a side quest and mini game for me. I really like Queen's Blood. I found the learning curve for it was quite difficult. It's much more advanced in compared to Triple Triad, which was basically a numerical system, and it's sort of whoever's got the highest number will flip the cards. That's essentially how Triple Triad works. And I'll go into this, as you say, I've got an episode on it and I go into more detail. But there's a lot of things going on with Queen's Blood in terms of the cards have their own unique attributes. Then you also have the layout of the board, how cards can be laid down. There's much more intricacies there. So it is a more complex game, but I did find it really enjoyable. How about you guys? Did you get into Queen's Blood much thus far?
For my second playthrough, I've been playing as much Queen's Blood as possible, But when I originally played the game, I didn't really get into it because I didn't understand the rules until a bit later in the game. So I sort of skipped it. But I think it's very it's interesting, the approach where sort of every character you can play has a specific personality. It's sort of distinct from Final Fantasy VIII, where you can play maybe a lot more people, but here you only have a few people you can play, and you're not expected to sort of grind it. You can just play one match, and if you win, then you sort of check that off your list. While in Final Fantasy VIII, you get to play the same people hundreds of times, maybe if you're trying to get some specific card, which will then junction into something else. But having sort of learned the rules, I do really enjoy Queen's Blood as a game. How about you, Peter? Did you play Queen's Blood?
I didn't, but I find it interesting to be in the minority of people who enjoyed Tetra Master from 9 more than Triple Triad. And I say minority, but you could still play it through Final Fantasy XI in the old days. You could pay an extra $1 and get to play Tetra Master as a standalone thing, which leads me to believe it's actually maybe more interesting, more popular in Japan, maybe. But no, I haven't played Queen's Blood.
One thing that I find interesting about Queen's Blood, obviously I don't want to labor on it too much, but actually what you get with a lot of mini games and side quests in Final Fantasy games is the payoff for them is normally something utilitarian. So weapons, items. So classic example, Triple Triad. If you choose to, you can refine those cards into really high level rare items. The payoff for Queen's Blood is actually primarily narrative. And what they chose to do with Queen's Blood, as we find as we go through the story, is actually it has much more of a narrative sort of payoff and a narrative sort of arc to it than it does actually any sort of utility. Also, there's the question of stakes. So, for example, in Triple Triad, if you lose a game, you can lose like a really the NPC will take one of your high-ranking cards, like E3 or whatever. In Queen's Blood, there's no such risk, so you can sort of replay, and if you lose, there's no real sort of, you're not kind of losing anything. So it's interesting because I've spoken to people. I got some comments on that episode saying actually they liked that there was no stakes because they could just carry on playing until they won, whereas some people actually they preferred the risk and reward element. And I suppose that depends on your approach to mini games.
I think ultimately, if you would be able to lose cards in Queen's Blood, you would just have the problem of always being loading your save games or something like that. Because even in Final Fantasy VIII, it would have been interesting in Final Fantasy VIII if the cards went into some sort of circulation, and you would be able to reacquire them.
Well, once in a blue moon, the NPC they will play your card back in a hand, but it's like you will have to play multiple times to try and get that happening sometimes. So.
Yeah, okay. I just haven't experienced it because I've never allowed myself to lose a great card.
Yeah.
But the world would be a better place if we had more Final Fantasy VIII lover boys.
I agree.
Yeah. And we will, of course, be discussing Queen's Blood a lot more in future episodes. But one thing that sort of also strikes me about Queen's Blood is that I'm not necessarily in love with the name in and of itself, and sort of the narrative promise that is embedded in the name. And I haven't finished the Queen's Blood quest, so maybe I'll be proven wrong.
I agree. It's interesting thinking about the names because you're right. The name struck me as strange because it's very much a narrative. It's a narrative thing, as you say. Whereas Triple Triad is obviously it refers to sort of the game board. It's it's much more utility and I suppose straightforward sort of naming convention. There was a bit weird.
And also, like playing Queen's Blood in real life, it seems like a hassle because you have to carry around not only like a gaming mat but also like 2 castles. Yeah, and they like breathe fire.
Yeah, but you're right. There are numerous sort of fan-made Triple Triad board games, and they look fantastic. I've never seen one in real life, but you see things posted online, and they look really cool. But with Queen's Blood, you have all the markers that you would require to sort of play out those particular games. So 3D printers exist now, so I'm sure people are managing it. But yeah, I think that would be a hassle.
Didn't we play a version of Triple Triad at the last CupoCon in Glasgow, Norway?
Yeah.
We got a fan-made deck.
Nice.
That was
I don't
pretty-
remember what it's called. It has like a specific
No,
name.
They have a bootleg version of it, but it's interesting to play in real life, and you don't need a game mat per se, so it's just pretty accessible.
Yeah. So if I may, if we segue into Folios, because what's interesting is where and again, this is my subjective experience being a long-time Final Fantasy player, but where I thought Queen's Blood was a sort of nod, perhaps, to Triple Triad. When I went and started exploring the Folio system, it reminded me of the Sphere Grid from Final Fantasy X. I was just like, oh wow, this is like an interesting new dynamic they've introduced. That sort of it runs into, well, it sort of relates quite closely to the synergy system. You know, a lot of the abilities you can unlock there relate to the synergy abilities we discussed in the first episode, where you can sort of unlock new abilities between different party members. But also you have, I mean, I suppose it does follow the Sphere Grid in large degree, because it gives you certain skills and level ups as well.
It made me actually miss the Sphere Grid, which is more granular. You can like add an attack +5 or evasion +3 and go. You can really sort of plan out your route, how you're going to go through it in the advanced version of the Sphere Grid. But this seems, it's not watered down, but it's definitely a simpler version of the Sphere Grid, which I really do like.
Yeah, and I think in part as well, it's replaced, a mechanic they had in Remake, which I really quite liked, which was, do you remember you could sort of go into your weapons? Like in the menu, you could like go into your weapons and then skill up like through your particular weapons and stuff. I thought that was really cool. But yeah, they seem to have sort of changed things up a little bit more here.
Yeah, I was always trying to get into the weapons in Rebirth, and I just thought I had selected some wrong option.
Yeah,
that I couldn't do it. I accidentally set it to automatic or something.
Yeah, I do think the menus were a little bit confused here. So actually, in the first episode, Peter, you were talking. Obviously, you're a game dev, so you were kind of attentive to these game dev things. As a UX designer, I was sort of going in, and as the menu becomes more advanced, so for example, when you start being able to select your party and stuff, I was going in and finding bits like that were less intuitive than I might have hoped and expected. When just sort of looking through the menu options.
But one thing that struck me as sort of interesting about the Folios is that Broden, when he's telling you about the town, he's really selling you on this idea that you should go to Magnata Books, and like that's the first store of this type in the world or something, and then you get there and you have this Guado looking thing on the wall, like the Guados from Final Fantasy X, and they ask, do you have Folios? And I'm just there asking myself, what is a folio in terms of the lore? How does this make sense in the world? What is this place?
Yeah. And I think a lot of stuff, it comes through in like the narrative arcs and the NPC sort of dialogues. So I think as you walk in, when you first walk into the folio place, I think Aerith is stood outside. And like, oh, this guy is dressed like he's a planetary sort of guy, you know? And I was like, so then in retrospect, I was like, oh, is he one of these sort of Cosmo Canyon types? You know, is he into this sort of planetary Bugenhagen sort of thing? And it's almost like they've created this subculture that, again, is just amplifying and developing on the original, but it's not stuff we would particularly see there, whereas sort of there's this sort of hippie-ish sort of, you know, out one with nature sort of group of people that for some reason are facilitators of the folios. But that's what I took from those indirect pieces of dialogue, was like, okay, he's like a planetary guy, he's into this sort of thing. And you know, Final Fantasies, they lend a lot to zodiac systems and stuff, and I think there's a lot of that sort of aesthetic in the folios as well, like astrology and things like that, you know, this sort of planetary vibe.
Yeah, I'm interested in seeing, as we progress through the game, whether something will happen if we keep continuing to visit these stores, because I didn't do that the first time around, or whether this is as deep as it gets. Like, I don't know, because Proto, he's really selling it.
Yeah.
He's like, you really need to go there. It's important.
We have a soft spot on this channel for stuff like save points that are actually maybe connected to the real world, or gameplay abilities and systems that might be connected to the world in some way. And we have a series on the save spheres in Final Fantasy X, because there's a short cutscene in which Yuna's father, Braska, touches the sphere, which means they're actually a thing in the
Yeah.
world, and there's a lore behind them. And
Yeah.
it's really interesting to see how that ties in.
Yeah, no, that's great. I also love stuff like that, and I've discussed those bits in the past. I mean, this is film terminology that normally relates to sound, but you've got diegetic and non-diegetic, which is basically like what can the actual characters see and touch and feel and hear, and then what's just for the player. And yeah, I really like stuff that sort of feeds into that. I think, again, a controversial example is the junction system. People thought that was like madness, but actually junctioning is the entire backbone of the story of Fantasy VIII. It's like Ultimecia alone, all of that is junctioning. So there's a reason those mechanics are there and work the way they do. But yeah, so regarding save points, just on that note, I like that in Final Fantasy VII Remake and Rebirth, they're like benches, but they've got the save point logo like graffitied on them, which is like awesome. Should we jump back to the narrative? Because actually, something that if you didn't play the demos of Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, I think it might have a bit more impact. But I played the demos. But basically, when Cloud exits the inn at Calm, the first person you speak to is Red 13. So Red 13 comes up to you and he's like, "Thank you," and then basically, essentially says that he wants to stay with you and sort of join your party for a bit. And I was like, okay, that's a cool cutscene. But I played the demo previously, so I already had seen Red 13 in action, sort of, being a playable battle character, for example, or being a battle character. So that was blunted, and I didn't really appreciate that. Actually, if we throw back to Remake, he featured at the end of Remake, but he wasn't playable. So this should have actually had a lot more sort of gravitas to it, at least for me. I mean, maybe people did love it. I'm sure they did. And he rendered beautifully in that cutscene as well. Red 13 did. But yeah, so he's officially joined the party now. So from there on, Red 13 is with us, which is great. And then we're opened out into the town square where we can run about the village. We can speak to Tifa, we can speak to Barrett. And this is where we get the relationship system, and I think it has a proper term. I keep calling it the relationship system, but we have a multiple choice sort of response to a statement that Tifa makes. So, for example, in the middle of Calm town, there's like a it's not is it a windmill or a?
It's not. I don't remember what it is, but it reminds her of the water tower.
Exactly. Yeah, and we have the option to reply to her. Yes, it reminds me of when we were together in Nibelheim, or it's just a water tower. Like, you can basically have a positive relationship sort of response, or a negative or a neutral one. And then we see these sort of emojis appearing above the heads of our party members that are sort of a neutral face or a smiley face or whatever it is. So instantly, in this moment, thinking back to the original game, I thought this is going to influence who we can potentially take on a gold saucer date in future. Yeah, so I found that interesting, and yeah, and I suppose it comes to like morals in video games as well, and I suppose who you sort of prefer and would want to sort of build that relationship within Final Fantasy VII, because I find it hard to be horrible to anyone. So I'm generally I try and be nice to everyone, but then, and we can talk about this now actually, is who you'd potentially prefer of Aerith and Tifa.
Wow.
Yeah. So like, as soon as we got these choices, my first thought was, I need to cultivate a relationship with Tifa. But then you run into Aerith outside the Magnata Books Folio store. And like you said, I just can't bring myself not to answer her in the most positive way possible. So even though I had the goal of sort of going on a date with Tifa, I couldn't follow through in practice.
I think this might be the spots where it's good to have played the original game, because I had the same thought you did. And as soon as I saw the system, I thought, this is going to be the date. So if I want to go on a date with Barrett, I better start working on that now. But if you don't know about that date, you might just think it's related to the synergy abilities, I guess. No, but yeah, like you guys, I am unable to be mean. And when I play games like Mass Effect, where you can really be mean and become like a renegade, or it's just, I find it really hard.
I suppose slightly contrary to that, Mass Effect's a really interesting example because I know, if I recall rightly, I think in some cases in Mass Effect you can have like life or death consequences for who you're nice to and who you're mean to, sort of thing. I know there is a pivotal moment in one of the Mass Effect games that I recall is like whichever decision you make, one of your colleagues is going to die, sort of thing. Whereas here, so I did feel it was like lower stakes.
Yes, that's true.
in Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, and actually, so same as you, not really. I'm on my second playthrough now, so I'm making a concerted effort to be a complete douchebag to sort of everyone, just to see what happens. So in this calm instance, which is the first place where we were introduced to it, Aerith says, "Oh, would you like to go on a date to go to the top of this tower and look at the view?" And I said, like, no, I don't want to do that. Or I was like, I'm too busy, I think is the answer. And she's like, well, I'm going to take you anyway. And, you know, so there was no real, it would carry on pursuing the story in the same way, but it would just mean that she's much less likely to be my date scenario in future. So yeah, I didn't feel the stakes were quite as bad with the relationship thing here.
If we walk a little bit around Calm, we mentioned Tifa and her sort of reminiscing about the water tower. You can also run into Barrett down at the bar, and he sort of says that until they finish what they're doing, until they save the planet, he's not going to drink any alcohol. Which was very interesting to me because I just finished reading The Kids Are All Right, one of the Kazushige Nojima novels. And in that novel, there is a scene, maybe not a scene, but there's a reference to Barrett drinking once geostigma has been cured, I think. So I thought that was a sort of a nice reference for Barrett. And then we have Red 13 somewhere by the entrance of Calm, and he sort of wants to be taken seriously and doesn't want you to call him a good boy or something.
Yeah. I think I love that you keep referencing Nojima. You should be sponsored by him because you've inspired me. So I've bought the Kids Are All Right, and I've got Traces of Two Pasts, which I'm reading first because I think it's the most directly relevant to the actual bit we're going into. I mean, I've started reading it, and it's directly corresponds to chapter 2 when we're about to sort of go out. I think Calm was interesting as well, and again we kind of touched on this with Nibelheim, but my initial impressions of Calm, I don't know, what did you guys think of the village of Calm?
It reminds me of back when they were making Final Fantasy 13, and they were talking about this issue with creating towns. That's the reason there are no towns in Final Fantasy 13. And then in Final Fantasy 15, you basically only have one town. And so I thought it was a very nice change of scenery in a way to actually get a town like Calm in Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, and I really liked Calm, and I much prefer it to, for example, the towns of Final Fantasy 16, like Martha's Rest or something like that, or Northreach. It just felt very alive, and
it sort of gives you. It gave me Kingdom Hearts vibes, like Traverse Towns, and it gave me a sort of whimsical feel, which was really refreshing. And I really liked Calm, and it was like much more expansive and interesting than it was in the original, to me at least. There wasn't much to do there.
Yeah, I agree. I enjoyed Calm as well. I liked that they quite faithfully actually brought the music back for Calm as well. And I think exactly, and Traverse Town is a perfect example. And I actually tweeted about this just the other day, but there's very much a convention in Final Fantasy, and I suppose Kingdom Hearts, that example of the first town. And in the first episode, we were talking about Tolkien and the references to Tolkien and how a lot of things are modeled on Tolkien. And I think in Lord of the Rings, we have all this dramatic stuff in the beginning, and then they end up in the village of Bree, and that's the first sort of respite that the party of hobbits have. You know, they stay at the inn at Bree. And I feel like in so many Final Fantasies, they've followed that convention where we have Besaid in 10, we have Dali in 9, Balam in 8, Traverse Town. You know, they're just these nice, whimsical, happy vibes sort of towns where, you know, just before we launch back into the drama and launch back into the adventure, we have this respite. So I thought it was great, and they transferred that over really, really well and really faithfully into Rebirth here.
Well, speaking of this peaceful town, one thing I noticed at the bar, I think, is that you could hear a report by the Shinra news network. And like we discussed in the last video, the game starts with the destruction of a huge part of Midgar, but then that's sort of in another world or something. But then at the bar in this world, they're also reporting on a tornado that is ripping through Sector 0, 1, and 2. So that's also happening in this world, which I thought was interesting because that's not something that happened in the original game. But yeah, and then of course Shinra comes in full force. No, I'm not going to do this story. So where do we go now?
Yeah, but well, I think the Shinra arriving is quite an interesting and pertinent point. Because, I mean, the fact that they chose to do that. So I have mold on this, and I think it's maybe for a couple of reasons. Firstly, I think it links us back up with where we left off with Remake, because again, just jumping back to the start, as we discussed chapter 1 in the first episode, we had the Nibelheim flashback, and then we had the alternative universe craziness with Zack. So actually, this is the genuine jumping off point where actually we've left off Remake, and this is what's happening now. So I think it links those two things back up, because actually the party is being pursued by Shinra now. And it's sort of trying to sort of rebuild that momentum that left off with the motorcycle chase and stuff in the original game. I think secondly, it forces a degree of linearity, because we can't hang around and do the side quests and bits in calm. It's like they want to push us on and force us through the adventure a little bit more. So I think that's what perhaps prompts the Shinra showing up, and that's, I suppose, the sort of narrative mechanical reason for doing so. We're kind of forced out of calm. We've talked about, these few points of the Queen's Blood, the Folios, and the party relationship thing, but that's not it. Right before we leave, Broden gives us the item transmuter as well. So it's like yet another piece of mechanic and stuff that we're offered here. Interestingly, in one of my most recent episodes, I was discussing Rebirth, and I mentioned that it's content rich. Someone replied to me and they said, I wouldn't say so much content rich, I'd say content dense. And I think that was a very interesting point to me, because yeah, it's like how much is too much? Could they have paced it out? So on and so forth. So I think that's neither here nor there. It's perhaps subjective, but I do find it interesting that we were introduced to all of this stuff in quick succession while we're in Calm. So the Shinra arrive. They force us to escape from the village of Calm with the assistance of the innkeeper Broden, and then we have this payoff, which I absolutely loved. And again, I think, which is where we basically escape Calm and we open out into the big wide world, the grasslands, and we get a wonderful cutscene to sort of complement that. And I did wonder why they made such a meal out of this in terms of having this cutscene and stuff. And then I remembered there was so much speculation about to what extent or not Final Fantasy VII Rebirth would be open world, particularly compared to Remake, which was obviously set just within the confines of Midgar, and it was, sort of by comparison relatively linear and certainly not open world. And then we had Final Fantasy 16, which it sort of had compartmentalized the world, which I really quite like that. So there was a lot of speculation off the back of those two installments as to where we go with this. So I think the cinematic here was like a sort of payoff.
Yeah, they're really showing off what we are expected to explore later on. One thing that struck me about that scene is that at one point Aerith sort of looks almost straight into the camera. It's not directly at the camera, as he says something like, "You coming?" Sort of like an invitation to the player. And it reminded me of Final Fantasy X, with the this is my story, this is your story bit, because it's sort of interesting in the case of Final Fantasy X, if we compare the English and the Japanese, is that in the English version, Tidus very early on says, "Listen to my story." So the my storyline comes almost at the beginning of the game, while it doesn't do that in the Japanese version. actually your storyline, my storyline, doesn't come until you get the first person perspective of Tidus looking up at Auron. So you have this sort of role-playing element in a way where they're saying, you are the person who is playing this game, this is your story. And just like Auron says, this is your story, Arthas says, you coming, and then we come. Yeah. So
You're making work for me here. No, but yeah, it's a good point, because there was a lot of discussions about in which way the world would be navigated, and I was afraid it would be like Final Fantasy 16, which is a system you said you like, which I did not really care for. It made the world feel pretty small. So I was happy to see that it's a really quite expansive, nice, quote-unquote seamless world. I will say, at the risk of being too negative again, like the navigation around this grassland was very janky, and you sort of run into invisible walls and not sure where you can go and where you can't go, which sort of it took a lot out of it for me. The enjoyment, I couldn't just run around and feel free and jump around. It felt a bit more confined than it was presented to me at first. I don't know how you guys felt about it. Like, did you feel truly free in this vast grassland?
I think I felt a lot freer than I expected, which was great. I think in terms of the invisible walls and bits like that, that was a little bit janky for me. So there is a dedicated action button where actually you can prompt Cloud to sort of jump at certain intervals, like if you're at a cliff ledge or something like that. So sometimes he does that automatically, like without you pushing the button, he will jump. Sometimes you need to push the button to jump, and then sometimes he won't jump at all because it's not the correct sort of ledge or sort of action point, whatever. So that was a little bit janky for me, that those sorts of movements and interactions with the world through Cloud. I did find that just at times a bit strange. I did notice there was a lot of complaints from people about the yellow painted walls. Like I saw people kind of kicking off about that, and I was like, I don't know, for me that's just an accessibility prompt. That's like, that was fine. I didn't really.
I don't mind that at all. That's just this is a video game.
Yeah.
It's pretty straightforward, I think. But I agree with Pétur that there is a sort of a level of deception in a way that you see this big open world, and just from playing other games, there's a level of expectations about being able to sort of freely explore it, and then you aren't able to do that, and that can be a little bit frustrating. But it's something that I got over fairly quickly. So yeah, we have the grasslands. One thing that I liked about the grasslands is the sort of added lore. One of them being how sort of Titan seems to be the Titan seems to have had an effect on the landscape of the grasslands. That in ancient times there was a being called Titan, and he threw some rocks, and that's why it looked like that. And you also see a reference to this in The Kids Are All Right. If you remember Healan, which is the place that Rufus goes to heal, no spoilers. No, which is a Shinra facility for healing. They describe that the scenery there as if somebody had threw some rocks all over the place. And that seems like a sort of reference to Titan, I feel. But one thing that struck me about this whole Titan thing, and also the Livestream Springs, the crystallized, is that when you go to these places, you get the prompt to press some buttons, right? Like triangle 3 times for the Livestream Springs, and then you have this rhythm for the summons. And these are fairly sort of very simple. They're very simple. You don't have to have a lot of skill to be able to do this, which is sort of disjointed, I feel, from what's to come, where you have a lot more sort of involved rhythm button pressing. So I would have liked to see that being reflected in to a larger degree in these short segments where you are learning more about the summons or just activating these Livestream Springs.
Yeah, I think that's a good point to touch on, actually, because that's one of the many sort of content rich or content dense, depending how you want to look at it. That's one of the many things that's now that's shortly to become on offer with these sort of open world map segments. So just to catch up chronologically, we have the cinematic where we open out into the world. We can run around and explore the grasslands in a very sort of one-to-one sort of ratio, whereas of course when we look at the older RPGs, the 1997 game, it was like a minified, abstracted world where we're traversing a great span in like a few seconds. So we have this one-to-one relationship with the world now, which the world has been a bit more shrunk down. And for some reason, and I didn't get this, and part of the reason I'm reading Trail of Two Paths is I don't know if they're a character in this because it's weird, but Broden tells us to go to Oliver's farm. So we have this location in the grasslands called Oliver's farm, and we meet Oliver, and he just tells us to go. He basically tells us to get a chocobo, I think.
It tells us to go to the swamp or something.
The swamp, and then the swamp, we need to get a chocobo to get across the swamp. So this Oliver guy just didn't serve any purpose, and I'm not sure why he was involved there. Although we do see I think the first time we see one of the much celebrated vending machines is actually at Oliver's farm. So we have the vending machines and the benches and those sort of item acquisition save point bits there. So we go to the swamp, and we're prompted that we need a chocobo to cross the swamp, and then we end up at Chocobo Bill's farm. A few things happen there, but one of the things that happens at Chocobo Bill's farm shortly is that we're reintroduced to Chadley, who was quite a controversial minor character from Final Fantasy VII Remake, who for some reason they opted to give a much bigger role in this game, considering how much animosity seems to be aimed at him. And he basically opens us up because he's on this exploratory mission to understand more about the world around us and stuff. And we still have this stuff carry over from the original game, which is where, from the remake, where we can unlock the summons through him by using the combat simulator. So we still have that there. But then we have, additionally, the life springs that you've mentioned. We have combat things with fiends. We can defeat fiends, and he kind of learns things about them. And then we have those towers that are basically the Assassin's Creed sort of things going on. So basically, the world map once we meet Chadley, the world map becomes very populated with things that we can sort of explore. But yeah, you're right. Just going back to your point about the life spring wells, they were one of my favorite of all of the things we can do through having met Chadley. I love the life spring wells because of the lore they give us, and we can sort of access these sort of these chapter notes through the menu that tell us about the history of the grasslands or wherever we happen to be. I thought that was like really cool. Just builds out that world of Final Fantasy VII so much more than what the original game had previously managed.
It was really good to you find the Titan Shrine and just to see a summon in Final Fantasy VII being grounded in the world in that way, because it wasn't really grounded in the original game. They talked about them a little bit, and you had them equipped, but it didn't feel like a big, huge part of the world lore. Not like Final Fantasy 15, where it's the lore. So just to see them in the world and to be able to tangibly see their effects.
Yeah, I really liked how they handled the summons here, because in a lot of ways, Final Fantasy VII is actually quite a refreshing game for me. Like, I loved how the GFs were handled in Final Fantasy VIII. Again, they're quite a subtle thing. I mean, they kind of create this memory loss or whatever they do. Final Fantasy IX, again, the Eidolons were kind of, they were pretty important because you had the summoner class. It was very much a throwback game. And then Final Fantasy X, Final Fantasy kind of 13, 15 and stuff, they just progressively became much more involved in the story. And 16, again, they were hugely important to the story. In fact, the story kind of hinged around them to a large degree. So looking back to Final Fantasy VII, the original, and I think to a degree this game as well, it's just like just having them as abilities was fine. I don't think you need to hinge every story around these big godlike deities. It's not necessary, and I think it's just because in succession we've had these mainline games that really sort of focus on them in the story. So yeah, for Remake and Rebirth, I did wonder, even before Remake came out, I was like, I wonder how they're going to handle them, because you can't really ignore the fact that these summonable beasts are just coming into battle, destroying everything, and then disappearing again. Like, really, you sort of need to acknowledge that somehow in the lore and in the story. So I think the way they just made them these subtle deities that exist, and they have their little shrines and caves and stuff, is fine. So they're still sort of the background, but it works. It works really well, I think.
And I wonder, like, are these shrines related to the ancients, or? Yeah, they are tangible things in the world, at least. So I'm curious who left them. And also, speaking of people leaving things, we also get to acquire a Proto relic, which is reminiscent also of the Proto materia in Final Fantasy VII Dirge of Cerberus. And I just started to wonder, what is this Proto referencing? Does it predate the ancients, or is it something related to the ancients? I feel like using the word Proto there implies that it's primitive enough to sort of predate something like the ancients. So I'm interested in seeing, because I didn't finish the Proto relic quest during my first playthrough, I'm interested in seeing where it will lead in a way. But I suspect that maybe they aren't going to talk a lot about what this Proto is implying, but we'll see.
I really like the Proto relic quest. I did find them quite engaging, but again, just to be slightly pedantic, I suppose, is one thing I noticed is I didn't actually start doing the side quests until sort of later in the game. So I actually started with the second Proto relic quest, and I got a cutscene. The cutscene payoff was chronologically the second cutscene payoff for the Proto relic quest, and I was like, okay, that doesn't really make sense. Then I went back and I did the first Proto relic quest. So basically, the cutscenes, the payoffs for that little arc, they play sequentially based on the quest, not on the player having completed 1 and then 2 and then 3, if that makes sense. So actually, it was kind of out of sequence for me, and I thought that was strange for like an advanced game. It was like, surely they would have based it on you having played them sequentially rather than sort of this quest has this cutscene, if that makes sense.
But it's always nice to see Gilgamesh.
Yes, absolutely. I really, yeah. As soon as I found out, so I was playing the game at the same time as my friend, and he was messaging me. Like, we just messaged back and forth, like, where we're at in the game. He was like, "Oh, have you seen Gilgamesh yet?" And I was like, "No, where's he?" And he was like, "Dude, play the Proto relics." I was just like, "Wow, yeah." So that was the whole incentivization for me, was just to see Gilgamesh with those.
And I think that's one of the things that Final Fantasy VII Rebirth has that games like Final Fantasy 16 doesn't have as much, is that you feel that there is a lot more going on in the world, or things to sort of uncover in a way. So I thought that was a very welcome change.
So we arrive at Chocobo Bill's farm. One thing quite interesting, after we get that, we're obviously prompted to get a Chocobo to cross the match. And we have the first, again, a first of several sort of mini games, I suppose, which is Chocobo wrangling, which I quite liked. They kind of escalate, but how did you feel about them?
So like the first one, at least, is fairly straightforward, and you also actually get, in the Proto relic quest, you also have this sort of stealth segment there. And even though I really like games like Metal Gear Solid in sort of theory, I've never been very good at stealth. So, but for the first Chocobo wrangling quest, I thought it was quite good, I think. Peter, how do you feel about it as a avid Metal Gear Solid fan?
Yeah, I'm a big Metal Gear Solid fan, which means I'll excel at all sorts of stealth challenges. So, I mean, I played the basic. I mean, so I guess there are more rankling video games Is that what you're saying? So they escalate in.
Maybe.
But yeah, this one was pretty tame, and we just got through it, and no complaints from me.
Yeah.
But it's interesting that they keep throwing all these mini games at you.
Yeah.
Or like the stuff to do, whether it's vacuuming Mako in the reactor or wrangling Chocobos, and yeah, so it's very dense in that way.
Yeah, and I've seen a lot of positivity towards Final Fantasy VII Rebirth. Like I really loved it, but I have seen adverse comments where people are like, "There's so much in this game that actually it was derailing the story for them." You know, the momentum of the story was sort of reduced because there was so much going on, and so much, I suppose, necessary stuff going on as well. Because, for example, in earlier games, perhaps there was stuff you could sort of leave to the side and not have to do, and just venture through and sort of kind of stick quite closely to the story. Whereas Chocobo wrangling is like a necessity; like you have to stop and do that. You have to stop and do various things. So yeah, and again, that's sort of a subjective debate that's going on. I didn't mind it so much. I quite liked like the variety of stuff.
I very deliberately charged ahead with the story because I was afraid I'd have another Final Fantasy 15 on my hands, where it takes too long between story beats and I get distracted and derailed. And I really wanted to experience the story, so I did the minimum amount of side quests and I did a few towers and all that stuff. But I very deliberately just charged ahead with the story, and I think I understand why people do that.
So yeah, so we acquired the Chocobo. We go back to Chocobo Bill's farm, although it's those kids now. It's Chocobo Billy and that girl. And again, sort of not derivative at all, but there's sort of subplots within subplots here. So they're talking about how their parents disappeared or whatever, and they're talking about Chocobo Sam from Midgar. I think it's Chocobo Sam, his name. But they're very blasé about human trafficking in this game, I find. Like, they're talking about him, it's like, dude, he's like trafficking human beings, and everyone's just like, yes, Chocobo Sam. It's like, kidding me? Like, bizarre. But so yeah, so again, we sort of develop a little relationship with them, and are prompted for a side quest if we so choose. And then I think we meet Chocobo Bill the Elder as we're leaving, who really reminds me, I don't know if this is intentional, I think they've loosely designed him on Nobuo Uematsu. I don't know why, he just looks like it. He just looks like him to me. As soon as I saw him, I was like, that's strange. But yeah.
One thing that was interesting about Chocobo Bill is that going from the swamp, you can actually run into him.
Right.
And I did that the first time around, but not the second time around, I think. So it's sort of an optional scene in a way, which I thought was very, very nice, even though it's just a short scene. But speaking of Chocobo, well, Billy and his sister, they feel a lot more sort of lifelike than someone like Oliver on his farm, who doesn't really feel like an interesting character in his own right.
Yeah.
So it would be nice to see more consistency there. Like, if everybody was on the level of maybe Billy and his sister, the world would feel even more alive.
Yeah. Yeah, I absolutely agree with that. There's much more back and forth as well, because I remember this line, like, because Chocobo Billy, you know, he is imbued with a personality, and he's a bit of a trying to get money out of the party and stuff. And then Barrett responds to that. He's like, oh, he's hustling. He's like a businessman or whatever. And it's, you know, so they're building these personalities and this back and forth with the party, which I like. And yeah, I agree. I wish they'd done that with a few more.
As opposed to Chadley, the Pinocchio android boy, who I'd really like to get your opinion on, because I really don't really have one. It's just I try to avoid him as I can.
So I don't particularly like Chadley, but I've seen so many of those types of character in like anime and stuff. I'm assuming there is like a demographic in Japan, or maybe it's a Japanese stereotype or trope to have that sort of really frustrating character. I don't know. But I begrudgingly accepted him in this game because he does facilitate a lot of this stuff that we've discussed, these things to do in the open world. And I struggle to think of other ways that you could plausibly introduce that stuff and have a reason to do it. So him being there and making that stuff happen kind of makes sense, but I just don't really like him.
Like, I like him a lot more this time around, now that I know that we're sort of stuck with him. And it sort of reminds me of Jar Jar Binks from Star Wars, where he was really criticized after the first movie, and then it just erased his role in a way, or shrunk it quite a bit. So I'm actually a bigger fan of the approach that was taken in Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, when they just sort of went all in. We're making him bigger. And yeah. That being said, I'm not sure that we needed the monster assessment instrument. Like, now we have 2 Chadleys, and one of them is a girl.
Oh,
No.
yeah.
And it's a girl who speaks through your remote. So when you're trying to play silently while your children are asleep and you put the TV on silent, the remote is still speaking. I know you can change it in the settings, but I always forgot it. It was really loud.
Yeah.
But speaking of people and characters and the side quests, like the most interesting side quest for me, even though it wasn't interesting as a side quest by itself, was the side quest at the very end. If you finish all the side quests, you get to do a side quest related to Broden, the innkeeper, where you learn that he used to be a soldier and he is suffering from degradation. And it also sort of explains why Cloud runs into Sephiroth at the inn before he goes to meet Tifa, because Broden is sort of there, and so there is someone who has Genoa cells in them at the inn. So at least I sort of thought that was connected.
Yeah,
Because,
that's really interesting, because I didn't play that side quest, but it does make a lot more sense. Firstly, that you say, as you say, you see Sephiroth, but then even as you're leaving Calm, I mean, Broden does make some sort of cryptic remarks about having, suffered at the hands of Shinra or whatever. Can't quite remember. And then he's just sort of groaning in pain as you leave. And it's just like, what's going on with this guy? And then obviously there is payoff for that and understanding for that with that side quest that you mentioned.
It was a nice payoff. At first, I just thought he was a sickly man like me. Yeah.
Okay. So we've acquired our Chocobo, and we're now able to cross the swamp here, where the infamous. You can pronounce this for me.
Miðgarðsormur.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Where's MJ Gallagher when you need him?
Miðgarðsormur. Just, you maybe know this, Noko, but the original name Midgard Solom, like, was that just a bad translation?
That's just a bad translation.
Yeah, but I kind of like, it's kind of cool. I kind of like it.
Yeah.
The original name. Now it's really on the nose. Oh, it's like Midgarðsormur is just that thing. But Midgard Solom is like, oh, that's mysterious. And
So, and in the swamp as well, we see Cloud sort of spotting Sephiroth. And that's also in relation to a hooded man being there, who of course also has Genoa cells inside himself. It's an amazing thing. But yeah, I think it's interesting. Cloud is kind of frequently seeing these guys, the Genova clones, like the men in a black cape. If we compare that to the original, it's interesting because we never see them, and it's almost like Sephiroth is this illusory, not quite there entity. For example, we arrive at the village of Calm, which we've just done, and we're like, "Have you seen a man in a black cape?" And they're like, "Yeah, you've just missed him. He's gone." Always one step ahead. Whereas here, it's much more tangible. Like we're actually physically seeing these manifestations, these guys kind of that have the Genova cells, and they're obviously manifesting in Cloud's mind as Sephiroth. So I think it's interesting that they are like consistently there. They're actually present, and we're seeing them like much more. So yeah, interesting change there. That again, I wasn't averse to it. I thought it was quite cool actually. And then so we kind of we have that sort of narrative and the party are like, "What are you talking about? That's not Sephiroth. It's just some man in a cape."
and then we encounter the Midgard as it was once known. I think this was an interesting moment of the game because going back to Peter, your point in the last episode, we were talking about boss fights. There we were talking about Materia Keeper, and again now we have the Zolom, and it's like, so these boss fights weren't existent in these moments in their sort of in the legacy game. I do wonder to what extent they're sort of putting these boss fights in for the sake of it. I'm not sure why, because the narrative emotive impact in the previous game, the original game, we just see the Zolom like impaled on a tree, and it's like, did Sephiroth do this? And it's just like, we haven't even seen Sephiroth yet in the current events of that game, but the mystique of him and this sort of appeal, I don't know, they're sort of building the immensity of his character just through this chaos that he's leaving in his wake. It's like the same as the bloodstained Shinra headquarters and stuff. So instead of that, they've sort of removed that. There's no dead Midgard Zolom, but actually the Midgard Zolom is alive, and we have to fight it in a boss fight, which, as you've mentioned with Materia Keeper, was one of these kind of elongated, staggered boss fights that sort of goes on. So yeah, interesting change there. I think, again, it may even lend to the fact that they're leaning more towards this ARPG action-based sort of game, where actually it's like, okay, so we're building these sorts of games now where you do have these periodic boss fights, like at the end of each chapter or whatever.
I think they really missed the trick this time around. I get it that they want a really amazing boss fight, but this moment of finding the impaled Midgard Zolom and, as you say, seeing the destruction of Sephiroth, it's a really impactful big moment. And I wonder if they could have done it in a different way, if the swamp had multiple worms or something smaller, and then there's one really big one, and Sephiroth killed that one or something. And they do sort of reference it in the death of the Midgard Zolom in this one, so it sort of falls and impales itself on a big tree. But I guess that's just for the super fanboys to see that. But maybe it's just because I was 7 years old, but that's a core memory. That's just to have seen that happen. So I wonder what you guys think about, like, was the boss fight worth losing that moment?
Well, I think, as you say, they've sort of replaced it with a sort of comparable moment, I suppose. And in this moment, which basically what happens is Cloud sees another image of Sephiroth, and Sephiroth slays the Zolom sort of underwater, which then kind of flies out and as you say, impales on that tree. So they're trying to lean into it. I just don't feel it works as well as the original. I think actually you solved it just in your suggestion there. If they arrived and we had this impactful cinematic of the Zolom sort of dead, and then you had another whatever it is show up, and then so you get your boss fight out of that, but you still have this impact of the immensity of Sephiroth. Like that sort of works for me. But again, you know, I think a lot of people that are criticizing people like myself, who is comparing it to the original game, they're like, you have to understand this is a new game. It is essentially a continuity of the original game. It's sort of a sequel in many ways, perhaps. And Sephiroth is in a different capacity compared to how he was in the original. So I sort of, so when people kind of critique me that way, I'm like, okay, and maybe I should just sit back and enjoy the ride a bit more, and realize that actually the original game does still exist. It is still a thing, but there is part of me that just wanted to see that moment in current gen tech or Unreal Engine 4. But
one difference I noticed with the Midgard Zolom fight was that afterwards, once Sephiroth has killed it, is that Cloud says something like, to the effect that I knew Sephiroth was powerful, but this is something else. That's not his exact words, but he is surprised at the sort of progress he has made in terms of power. So that's interesting because it also, I think it's necessary in a game like this where it's a lot more sort of lifelike and realistic, because you have gotten to play as Sephiroth. And even though he was immensely powerful, he has sort of taken the next step and reached the next level. And it's nice to see Cloud sort of recognize that.
Right. So we've defeated the Midgazolem, we get the cinematic that sort of attempts to sort of mirror the original game, and then we enter the Mithril Mines. So again, this is something that happens in the original game, in the 1997 game, but as with everything in Remake and Rebirth, it's just been amplified to a much greater degree. It's much more involved and complexified. So rather than something we just simply traverse through and we meet the Turks and we have a bit of dialogue with the Turks, in Rebirth, it's basically a dungeon and we sort of puzzle our way through. There are some puzzle elements here that go on. And again, like a lot of things in Rebirth, I think they've sort of they've added to the lore and the sort of world building around it. So actually, rather than just a cave that we're in, there's like Shinra sort of equipment lying around, like discarded. We see this in the Grasslands world map as well. There's just these tubes, and we can really see the sort of influence that Shinra has had on the flora and fauna of the world, and the sort of industrialization and I suppose sort of decay that they've sort of left in their wake. So it's a very sort of dystopian sort of Mithril Mines compared to the original as well. And actually they go through, and there's some dialogue. I think Barrett starts talking about it, but they were talking about how Mithril was, and again, Mithril is of course a reference back to Tolkien. You know, it's this really strong sort of alloy metal in Tolkien. And they were talking about how they used to use Mithril to build stuff like weapons and whatever else. And then actually they were saying they've kind of developed much better stuff synthetically through the use of materia and Mako technology and that sort of thing. So yeah, I really liked how they built up the lore as we were sort of venturing through the Mithril Mines here.
It's also interesting to see the Mithril Mines being turned into sort of a museum. Like at the entrance of the Mithril Mines, they have like these posters and placards with information about the mines and sort of before you reach the depths of the mines, it's sort of set up as a nature reserve. Like they are preserving this piece of nature, but it's also of course become desolate and no one is going there anymore because the Juno Republic isn't a thing anymore, and nobody's taking care of public transportation like they used to. And yeah, so it's interesting to see the museum aspect, or not the aspect, like it's a new aspect there. They're like, I don't remember it being a museum in the original game.
So yeah, we venture through. Actually, sorry, Peter, did you have any thoughts on the museum?
No.
Okay. Fantastic. We'll continue. Cool. So yeah, so we're venturing through the Mithril Mines. Again, a bit more puzzling than what we sort of previously sort of had here for those that remember the original. And before too long, we encounter some familiar characters in a familiar scenario compared to the original, which is the Turks. And in this instance, we have Elena, who we're meeting for the first time. So we no longer have Reno and Rude, who were like the dream team from the original and remake, but we're introduced to Elena, who's sort of like a spunky young Turk for the first time, alongside Rude. And yeah, interesting, because another departure from the original, as we've discussed with the Midgazolem, there seemed to be another instance where Square saw fit to introduce another boss fight that wasn't there in the original game. So do you guys have any particular feelings towards that, or what did you think about this rendition of Elena as well? It's the first time we've seen. Actually, we saw her in Advent Children very briefly, I think. I mean, I think it's literally a screenshot of her, right?
Yeah, she is in the helicopter with Zhang, I think.
Yeah.
Where they go crashing down to a northern crater.
She's a very interesting character. Well, in a way that obviously someone so ditzy and I guess spunky, it doesn't really fit the stereotype of a highly trained operative in the field who seems like she's still sort of learning the ropes. It's very endearing, but it's it's not particularly realistic, which is fine. But I think she makes a really good contrast with Rude, and I think they work well together, actually.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that there, and I think the reason it works, and again, this is a new change compared to the original, but Rude in the original was pretty much a silent character for a large. I mean, he had small instances where he'd show something, but he was much more of a kind of silent character. Whereas here, he's more talkative, he's more upfront, and so this dynamic sort of is established between him and Elena. And again, going back to remake, which we haven't discussed together, perhaps that's the thing that we should do. But yeah, he's more talkative, and he has these sort of one-on-one boss fights and interactions in the remake as well. So I really like what they did with Rude, because yeah, I love the Turks, and I think they built him quite well here. So we go through that obligatory sort of scenario, and then, as with the original, Sung appears. And again, the characterization of Sung, I love. I think I mentioned before, but I love the Turks generally, and I think the way that they've built out their personalities in remake and rebirth has been really well done. But yeah, unless you've got comments on the boss fights, we'll move on to the next.
I'd just like to see, like, one of the things that I think Kazushika Nojima excels at is character development and character creation. So you might notice, if you're reading Traces of Two Pasts or The Kids Are All Right, that it really brings these characters to life. Characters such as Reno and Ruth and Elena. And one thing that is evident in this scene with Elena is, in a way, how fanatical she is and how ruthless she is in a way, at the same time, while also being sort of cute, because she says that Tsang would just kill the hooded man, which he then does when he actually appears. But she wanted to kill him, and so it's just sort of a blind devotion to the authority of Tsang.
Yeah, exactly. And actually, I mean, we could segue on the Turks for a moment here, because one thing I love about Elena and what contrasts her, and again, I think a lot of character relationships, a lot of the time they work is through contrasts, conflict and contrast perhaps, because Elena, as you say, she has this zeal, this desire to impress Sung, and it's sort of, because she's junior, she like doubles down on her commitment, and so she's much more driven. But then if we compare her with characters like Rude and particularly Reno, perhaps they're a bit more blasé. Particularly if we go back to the 1997 game, where it's just like, actually a lot of our interactions with them that could be boss fights, actually they're optional, because they're like, we don't really want to fight you, we're kind of on vacation or whatever. So they're a bit more blasé about their role. And then taking a step back from that is the Turks as an entity are sort of, I mean, they are part of Shinra, but also they have their own sort of autonomy and I suppose some degree of their own sort of ideals and moral compass as well. Frustratingly, I think a lot of this comes through in Before Crisis, which I've not played. I don't even know if that's. Do you know if that's been ported or anything?
I don't think it's playable through sort of legal means in a way.
Yeah, because I know that focuses really heavily on the Turks. But again, even through Crisis Core and these things, we sort of get this image of them, and perhaps Sung has more of a moral compass than he lets on because of, and his relationship to Aerith, for example, which comes through in remake and is hinted at. So yeah, I find them really interesting, and I think just again within that, the dynamic of Elena as opposed to the others is really quite stark.
It's very interesting because Sung sort of has this face behind the curtain where he has a moral compass in a way, but Elena, she's just gobbling up his front-facing face, where people are.
We're losing momentum here, guys.
My English eludes me. No.
So yeah, so we have this obligatory boss fight. We have this interaction with Sung, who attempts to sort of. Well, actually, we have a fantastic cinematic where I think Elena like roundhouse kicks a grenade or something crazy like that, and then the world explodes, the cave falls in, and this comes to a moment. Again, we're kind of coming to the close of the Mithril Mines, but actually this last segment leans into something that I really quite like, and I'm glad that Final Fantasy VII Remake and Rebirth have reintroduced this, as opposed to other more recent Final Fantasies like 16 and 15, which is that we sort of segue off and we actually start controlling Barrett. So the party sort of separates out, and then we go through this sort of dungeon puzzling sequence with Barrett and Red 13. And this is something they also did in Remake. They do it periodically through this game. And I think even though it is, Cloud is the protagonist of Final Fantasy VII, they've really sort of sought to retain this ensemble nature and giving equal weight to different characters in this game, which I loved. I love Barrett. I won't labor on him too much because not much sort of narratively important happens to him or Red 13 in this segment. But what we have seen, and we could have mentioned this because it happens at the inn at Calm. It happens when we open out onto the grasslands, and Barrett is like, we just walk in this direction, and is this penchant for comedy, and we start seeing the relationship between party members and this sort of goofiness and comedy sort of really come to life with in this chapter. As we come through the puzzling sequence with Barrett, we have I found it quite inane, but we have a boss fight with a golem rock formation. So we have this boss fight with the golem. We reconvene with the party, and one of my favorite moments of the game is this dialogue where Barrett is trying to make a joke. And again, it's just this character interaction and comedy between Barrett and Red 13, which actually comes out in periodic moments. But Barrett makes a joke out of getting sidetracked by fighting this rock formation. And he goes right to Red 13, as if like he's in on the joke as well. And Red 13 just completely ignores him and starts talking about something else to the party, like we need to get out of here. And it's such a funny moment. And it's trying to sort of establish this sort of comedy between those two. So I thought that was really cool. But yeah, any thoughts on the segue with Barrett?
No.
I do like that they force you to use different party members, because as a man of culture, I always just played Final Fantasy VII with Tifa and Aerith in my party. It's Cloud, Tifa, and Aerith. That's the way I played Rebirth. So I didn't really use Barrett and Red 13 a lot during my playthrough. But this forced me to sort of get to know their battle systems and how they work, which I thought was needed, because there are a lot of people like me who just play with the girls. So those are my thoughts on that chapter.
Yeah.
I
love playing with girls too.
Yeah. I did Tifa and Aerith for my first playthrough, but for the second time around, I've been doing Tifa and Barrett, and I feel like it's a great experience.
Yeah, I agree. And actually, considering the amount of anticipation for a playable Red 13 in this installment, because obviously he wasn't in Remake, I was actually surprised at how I just didn't care about playing as Red 13. I was not disappointed with his gameplay, but I didn't care for it, particularly compared to Tifa and Barrett, who I think are among my favorites in terms of controlling in battle and having in my party as combat allies. So yeah, I was very much sort of Barrett and Tifa as well for a huge portion of this game.
One thing that's interesting that's going on in the mines is this back and forth about the 2000 gil. The 2000 gil being a reference to what Cloud gets paid for the first bombing mission. And they sort of do favors for one another. Barrett opens something up for them, and they open something up for him, and they're always talking about this 2000 gil. And even though I can't play it, I can't play Ever Crisis in Iceland. But I noticed that there is a character there. I think it's Glenn, right? Who is sort of theorized to be potentially Cloud's father. Who talks about 2000 gil being all you need. So even though it's not a lot of money, you only need to have 2000 gil in your pocket, and things will work out somehow. So it's also interesting because when you look at the economy of Final Fantasy VII, it makes no sense for Cloud to take on this bombing terrorist mission for 2000 gil.
Yeah, that won't even buy you will that buy you an elixir? Maybe an ether?
Yeah. So it's interesting to see how they're sort of giving meaning to that amount of money. So retroactively.
So yeah, we complete the golem. We reconvene with the party, and then pretty much we kind of come to the exit of the mines and the closure of chapter 3, really. And much like how we were introduced to the grasslands, we sort of open out of this dungeon, of this cave, into a whole new segment of the wide world, and we gaze upon the former Republic of Junon for the first time, which is a great kind of introduction, I suppose, to the next chapter and the next segment of the story.
Which we'll get into on the next episode of this thing.
Yeah, we made it. We covered chapter 2 and 3. What an amazing journey we've been on. What an amazing journey this will continue to be. Thanks for listening. I would like to thank Alleyway Jack for once again being with us, and he will continue to be with us. But just in case, you should also go subscribe to his channel if you haven't already, because he's an amazing person with a YouTube channel.
Thank you very much.
Yeah,
and I think as well, I think you mentioned last time how you wanted me to get to 10k subs, which is very kind of you to do off the back of this podcast. I was thinking we might need to incentivize the audience somehow. So I was thinking, if I do get to 10k subs off the back of these episodes, then we should do a playthrough of Final Fantasy VII Remake. And yet, we have to do a shot of Icelandic fire wine every time Sephiroth appears, and just see how that goes.
I'm down for that.
Yeah, sounds good.
I'll do a topless as well. It'll be great.
Yeah.
I'll do
Use
it
an item of clothing every time.
I'll do it bottomless, like I am right now.
I am actually.
But yeah, so thanks for watching. We'll see you next time. Until then,
We do birds. Okay.
Okay.